Chapter 24, page 173. As Joe drifted into sleep aboard the Manhattan that night, the first light of dawn crept over Berlin, where Nazi police and soldiers were marching, groups of men, women, and children, through the streets at gunpoint. The rest had begun hours earlier, under the veil of night. The Nazis were moving gypsy families living in shanties and wagons out of Berlin suburb and into the detention camps. In time, they would be sent east to death camps and murdered. The removal was just one more step in the process that had begun unfolding for months. Nazis were transforming Berlin into something like a vast movie set, an artificial world with all the horror and anti-Semitism hidden away. The signs prohibiting Jews from entering public facilities had been taken down and stored for later use. A fiercely anti-Jewish newspaper had been temporarily removed from the newsstands. 1,400 homeless people had been rounded up and removed from the streets. Shop windows had been polished, streets had been swept and reswept. Trains freshly painted, broken windows replaced, books banned by the Nazis temporarily reappeared in bookshop windows. Joseph Goebbels, the man who helped convince Hitler to host the games, handed locals a script for their performance when they met foreigners, instructing them to be charming, easygoing, and welcome to all. On the Manhattan, the trip over was difficult for Don Hume and Roger Morris. Hume had developed some kind of a cold in Princeton. Now he and Morris had became terribly seasick. But Joe was enjoying himself. He was meeting with other Olympians and eating all the food he could find. The athletes were expected to remain in tourist class areas of the boat. The first class was supposed to be for the sort of people Joe had seen on the golf courses of Princeton. But the boys did not think much of this class business. Soon they were prowling on plush carpeting through a maze of corridors leading into spacious cabins with wood paneling and a smoke lounge with wood-burning fireplace, and a grand ballroom with high white plastered ceilings, marbled columns, and delicately hand-painted murals. They had found the first-class dining room with its own orchestra balcony and dining tables draped with 8 elegant tablecloths. And they found the great saloon where movies were shown every evening. Soon they were discovered that when 5 or 6 large men who had just happened to be Olympic oarsmen sat in the grand saloon, no one was about to remove them. So they took to visiting the upper decks every evening, stopping on their way into the grand saloon to swipe a platter of hors d'oeuvres and passing it around as they watched the show. One afternoon, Joe returned to his cabin to find a new rowing uniform. There was a pair of white shorts and an elegant white jersey with the U.S. Olympic shield. Red, white, and blue ribbons were stitched around the neck and down the front. The fabric of the jersey was smooth, almost like silk. He held it up for a better look, and it shimmered in the light, streaming in through his porthole. The jersey immediately meant the world to Joe. He had never been beaten. He had never been obliged to follow his old custom of surrendering his jersey to a rival oarsman. He had no intention of letting this jersey be the first. Joe Rance was taking this one home. On the morning of July 24th, the ship docked in Hamburg, Germany. The boys awoke early to unload the husky clipper. They were edgy, anxious to get off the boat, except for Don Hume, who was still fighting some kind of cold. They had put on 5 or 6 pounds during each during the 9-day voyage. They were starting to feel flabby and out of shape. They wanted to stretch their arms and climb into a racing show. By noon, they were on the train to Berlin, and when they arrived in the city's Plateau Old Lanther station, The afternoon, they were stunned. Thousands of Germans had packed the stations to get a glimpse of them. A black locomotive with swastikas emblazoned on its sides loomed nearby. A brass band struck up a song. The athletes boarded the open-topped buses and followed a parade route through the cities. Tens of thousands of Germans cheered and waved Olympic, Nazi, and occasionally even American flags. Later that afternoon, the boys finally arrived at what would be their home for the next several weeks. A police cadet training the Academy of Kopnet, a quaint village a few miles away from the Olympic rowing course. Unlike most ancient buildings in town, the police academy was modern looking, all glass, steel, and concrete. Most of the cadets had been moved out to make room for the American oarsmen and others. Unfortunately, even though the buildings were brand new, it was cold and there was no hot showers. The next morning, the boys awoke early, eager to get out of the water. After breakfast, a gray German army bus transported them 3 miles down the Langer See in Racecourse Egernu. When they arrived, the boys discovered what they were going to share a shell house with, the German crew. A fine new brick and stucco building called Haus West. Over the entrance, an American flag and Nazi flag faced each other. The German oarsmen were courteous but hardly gushing with enthusiasm to meet the boys from Washington. They seemed to be a bit older, and they were exceptionally fit and disciplined. They were almost military in the way they carried themselves. The boys finally took to the water, and the results were spectacularly disappointing. The timing was all off. The poles were weak and inefficient. The Canadian-Australian crews practicing sprints blew past them with smirks on their faces. Albrechtsen had never seen them row so poorly. The boys had gained a lot of weight, and almost all of them had colds. Don Humes seemed to be getting worse, and the chilling winds on Langer See and the cold, drafty police barracks hardly helped. Over the next few days, the boys fell into a routine. Rowing badly in the morning and then heading into Berlin for the afternoon, they took in shows, visited tourist sites, and brought bratwurst sausages from street vendors. Over and over again, ordinary Germans greeted them by extending their right hands and palms down, shouting, "Hail Hitler." The boys took by responding, extending their own hands and saluting their own leader, President Roosevelt. They'd shout, "Hail Roosevelt." Germans, for the most part, pretended not to notice. But those afternoon yachts weren't enough to improve the crew's morale. They were still rowing terribly. Gordy Adam, Don Hume were still sick. But by July 29, Hume was too ill to row. Too ill, in fact, to get out of bed. Albrechtsen put Don Coy, a substitute, had made the trip in at the critical stroke position. But when they practiced with Coy in the stroke seat, the boat just didn't feel right. Albrechtsen was deeply concerned now. As the crew from other nations arrived at Grenu, he and Pocock were spending a lot of time down by the water studying the competition. The Germans had to be taken very seriously. The Italians also looked like a threat. They had lost to California in 1932 Olympics by only 0.2 of a second. Now 4 of the rowers from that boat were back for another chance. The Japanese crew from Tokyo Imperial University rowed in a small shell with short oars and small blades, and they averaged just 145 pounds per oarsman, but they could accelerate at an astonishing rate. The Australians did not boast the best technique, but they had fire and strength. Above all, though, Pocock and Albrechtsen believed the British were the boat to beat. Rowing was traditionally a British sport, and the oarsmen, coxswain, that British had sent to the 1936 Olympics were the best of the British best. William George Ranald Mundell-Laurie, also known as Ran, was perhaps the best British stroke of his generation. He was 188 pounds of power, grace, and keen intelligence. Along with the coxswain, George Norrell Duckworth, a small man with a great heart, Laurie had piloted his crew to 3 major victories in a row. In the famed boat race in the Thames River in London, they had already raced and won in front of 500,000 to 1 million fans. To Albertson, that experience alone had to give British boys an edge. What most concerned Albertson about the British boys, though, is that their strategy. They liked to do exactly what the Washington boys did so well. They excelled at sitting back but staying close, rowing hard but slow, and mowing down their opponents at the end. Duckworth operated an awful lot like Bobby Mark, and Ran Laurie handled the stroke or an awful like Don Hume. It was going to be interesting to see what happened when the crews playing the same game met on Langer Sea. The 1936 Games opened officially on August 1st in a spectacular ceremony at the Olympic Stadium, but the rowing competition did not begin until August 12th. As the boys waited, the weather on Langer Sea turned positively wintry. A cold cutting wind blew down the race course. The boys rode in sweatshirts, their legs slathered in goose grease to protect them from the chill. The preliminary heats were less than 2 weeks away, but still hadn't regained their form. Their timing was off, they caught crabs, they were out of shape, and Don Hume wasn't getting any healthier. Since he had gone sick at Princeton, he had never really stopped coughing and dragging around. Unless he got healthy, Albertson figured that they would not have a chance. And then there was the matter of the race course. Albertson was not happy with how it had been laid out. There were 6 lanes. If there was a strong wind on race day, the 2 outermost lanes would be exposed and the crew struck there would be much harder to row. Lanes 1 through 4, on the other hand, struck close to the southern shore of the lake. They were protected from the wind through most of the course. Their crews assigned to the lanes would basically have two length advantage over the boats on the outside. Albertson wanted the outer lanes eliminated, but the German Olympic officials rejected the idea. As heat approached, Albertson grounded the boys. There would be no more trips into Berlin or anywhere else. The boys began to get tense and fidgety again. Nerves began to grow raw among the other crews as well. The Aussies made no effort to conceal their contempt for the Brits. The Brits could not even look at the Germans. They remembered fighting them in the last war, and they were worried if second one was coming soon. At lunchtime, one day the tensions erupted. The different crews ate together, and it had become a tradition for them to sing a national songs during meals. When it came time for the Yugoslavian crew to rise and sing, they launched into an odd rendition of Yankee Doodle. There was something about the way they sang that Chuck Day did not appreciate. He was convinced that they were insulting the United States of America, and he did not stand for that. Day bolted out of his seat and plowed into the Yugoslavians, fists flying. Bobby and Mark charged right in behind him, going for the biggest man on the crew. Right behind Mark came the rest of the Washington boys, and behind them, just for the fun of it, the entire Australian team. The German crew rushed to the side of the Yugoslavians. The boys shoved other boys. They threw chairs and hurled in insults. A few more fists flew. Everyone was yelling, but of all different languages, nobody could understand what anybody else was saying. Finally, the Dutch national crew dove in and settled everyone down. In the last few days before the first preliminary heat, the American boys worked on centering and calming themselves. None of them wanted to waste his chance at a gold medal. None wanted to waste it for the others. All along, Joe Rance had figured out that he was the weak link in the crew. He had been added to the boat last. He had often struggled to master the technical side of the sport. But when Joe didn't know what everybody in the boat felt exactly the same way. Every one of them believed that he was simply lucky to be rowing in the boat and that he didn't really measure up to the obvious greatness of the other boys. And he might fail the other boys at any moment. None of them wanted to let that happen. The boys began to draw even closer together. They took to huddling on the float before and after workouts, talking about what precisely they could do to improve. They draped arms over one another's shoulders and talked through the race plan. Speaking softly but with increasing confidence, they looked at one another in the eyes, speaking earnestly. They quoted Pocock to one another. They walked on the shores of the lakes, skipping stones, but the jokes and horseplays were gone now. They began to grow serious in a way they had never before. Hume returned to the boat and everything began to feel right again. They began to find their swing. They were back. All they needed now, Pocock told them on August 10, was a low competition, and they were about to get it.